you are a professor at McMaster University and the author of The 1 Minute Workout. So it's great to have you on our channel today, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity.
So, Dr. Gibala, I think everyone many people understand that exercise is something that we should do. It has many benefits. But the thing is, what is the best way to do it? And also, what is the most efficient, because time tends to be a limiting factor, or at least people believe it is. And so you've been studying interval training as a way of being more efficient at our training. So could you talk to what do you consider to be interval training? Could you kind of introduce what would fit within that envelope?
Sure. So interval training to me is just intermittent periods of relatively hard effort interspersed with periods of recovery. So that's a very simple definition. You'll notice I didn't use the word high or vigorous in there at all. And so interval exercise is just this idea of hills and valleys, going a little bit harder, backing off, taking a break, and repeating that. Now, that's a very unsatisfying definition for most people. I think when many people think about interval training, they think about high-level athletes. And any serious endurance athlete incorporates high-intensity interval training into their training because it's a well-established technique to optimize endurance performance. And they might get very sophisticated in terms of how they define interval training, various zones, linking that to heart rate or blood lactate levels. For the individual who's just interested in general health, we've been studying vigorous intermittent exercise. And we've increasingly started to use that term vigorous because it's well defined in exercise guidelines, public health guidelines. And so again, it's typically anchored relative to heart rate, perceived effort. And so, for example, a perceived effort level of 7 out of 10 or 14 or so on a 20-point scale, those would be the cutoff level or the minimum threshold to get into this idea of higher intensity interval exercise or vigorous intermittent exercise as a way to enhance health. You use the word efficiently. I prefer or like that term because I think if interval training offers really anything, it's the potential for efficiency. So you can get to your goal maybe a little bit faster, or you can get there with less time commitment or less total exercise amount. And you can get to a similar place as more traditional moderate intensity continuous exercise.
Okay, yes. And I'd like to dive into a lot of those pieces in more detail. So one thing is, so I'm looking at HIIT, various forms of HIIT. And I see there's Tabata, where it's like 20 on, 10 off. Or there's sprint intervals, which is 20 on, 1 minute off. Or there's something like 4x4, which is like 4 minutes off, 4 minutes on. And to me, they seem very different when you're doing them. Do they all have the same effect? Do they have different effects? And how would you choose between them?
Sure. So a couple thoughts there. You're right. So number one, we use this catch-all term interval training. Then to us, high intensity is getting into this vigorous intensity range, as we just talked about and defined. If you're an athlete, you might talk about getting into the severe intensity range. And athletes will use things like maximal lactate steady state or critical power. But let's just focus on the health side for now. So getting into this vigorous intensity range. And again, to me and many of my colleagues, you can break up high intensity interval training into HIIT and a more intense variant that's typically referred to as sprint interval training. And again, in a recent review that's about to be published, we've tried to delineate this a little bit more. And so if we look at the exercise guidelines, for example, from the American College of Sports Medicine, they have a category within the vigorous range termed near maximal to maximal. And so it's just that. So you're working very, very hard, close to your all-out sprint pace, or at what we'll sometimes call your sprint from danger pace. So you can imagine the pace that you would run or cycle at to save your child from an oncoming car or save a loved one or escape a burning building. So this is very, very uncomfortable type exercise, and typically you engage in it for short duration. So really the distinction there between high intensity and sprint comes back to intensity and the specific metrics you use to define it. I don't think we have a really good answer to the question of which of those are best. And so we use these, or many people are interested in optimal, best. And I think, the unsatisfying answer is we don't know which of those are best. And probably for most people, it doesn't really matter. And so if you're interested in interval exercise, what we typically encourage is try different types of interval training. Ideally, identify one that you might like or prefer, because fundamentally, or back to the basics, writ large, the biggest issue is that most people are insufficiently active. And so number one, it's just find something you like and enjoy. And if that's traditional moderate intensity exercise, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm sure we're going to get into VO2 max, cardiorespiratory fitness. I think there is some good data. Number one, to suggest that for a given dose of exercise, higher intensity or more vigorous efforts will potentiate the gains. And also longer intervals. So here we're talking 3, 4, 5-minute duration intervals at sort of the highest sustainable effort that you could maintain, repeated a number of times. That's probably the best way to potentiate gains in VO2 max or cardiorespiratory fitness. What I will say is, I think for a lot of types of interval training, we can think of this, curvilinear or exponential rise, where you can get a lot of bang for your buck with a couple of intervals. And then the more you do, you're getting increasing gains, but it starts to flatten out. My colleague, Dr. Stuart Phillips, when he talks about resistance training sets, he talks about wringing out the sponge. So you can imagine if you have a sponge soaked with water, you wring it once or you squeeze it, you get a fair bit of water out. And then the more you squeeze it, the more efforts, you're going to get increasing drips of water out. And so there's an analogy there in terms of you're still going to get gains, but a lot of the value or a lot of the benefit can come with only a few short, hard efforts. Now, if you're an elite athlete, you want to maximize the gains as much as possible. But if you're just an average individual looking to boost your fitness, it's not necessarily for you to go to these extremes all the time, or training as hard as you can, as long as you can, all the time.
Right. And so do you think there's ever a point where it starts to go down, where you can do in one session?
Can you do too much exercise? Absolutely. Can you do too many intervals? Absolutely. Right. And, athletes are mindful of overtraining all the time. So clearly a very high volume of very intense exercise can diminish gains and actually reverse some of the gains. So absolutely. And I think, applying that to individuals interested in health, the same way, they can do too much as well.
You can do too much. Okay. Just one interesting point. When I'm doing 4x4, the third run is actually the best. Does that sound correct? I mean, is that what you would expect?
I think, if there's one thing I've learned about interval training and exercise generally, we could give 100 people the exact same program. Some would thrive, some would wither, some would really enjoy it, some would absolutely detest it. And so I think this is highly individualized. I've heard a lot of people say it's that last one that I really enjoy the most because I know it's done at the end of that. So I think it's highly individualized.
If we're going to pick one of these and we're going to do them, what would be our total goal for a particular session? So how many minutes would we want to be? I guess how many total minutes or how many exercise minutes, whichever would be the correct metric.
Yeah. And, so if we look at the current public health guidelines generally, worldwide, are 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity exercise. Depending on the country or region, there's some variation on that. But, that's about 2.5 hours of exercise that the government or agencies would be recommending that we engage in. In terms of interval training, a question that often comes up is, do you count the recovery intervals? And I think the general answer is yes. And when I wrote my book, I interviewed Ai-Min Lee, who's a professor at Harvard University, who literally is involved in writing the public health guidelines. And I put that question out. And that was the answer that, yeah, you could count the recovery intervals. So you could imagine if you're, here in Canada, ice hockey is a popular sport, right? And the classic way that you engage in ice hockey is maybe one shift every third shift, right? So two other people jump over the bench and get on. So in a 1 hour hockey game, you might have 20 minutes of very intense effort on the ice, but you could count that as an hour of physical activity. So those recovery periods can count. So many team sports or other ways of engaging in activity in a group setting, you sort of count the entire period. If you're playing a tennis match or pickleball, you're not always exercising the whole time, but you'd count the entire duration as physical activity. In terms of the ideal or the best length of session, I don't think we have an answer. Our original work, we were often having 20 to 30 minute exercise sessions, and often people were doing this 3 times a week. Those were our classic studies, and it was pointed out at the time that, well, it's not that time efficient then if you're doing, 90 minutes a week or so of activity. And so over time, we've deliberately tried to shrink the time commitment. The title of my book is The 1 Minute Workout, but that's based on a protocol where we're using 3 20-second hard efforts within a total time commitment of 10 minutes. So if people are doing that 3 times a week, it's only 30 minutes a week of time commitment. And within that 30-minute block, it's only 3 minutes a week of very vigorous exercise. So again, by purposefully, we're trying to constrain the total amount of exercise because we're interested in that question of, how low can you go, or can you get away with this little exercise and still see benefits? That's not to suggest that that's the optimal way to train. And now that's led us to a series of studies that are ongoing right now, looking at the notion of exercise snacking, which is just 1 minute periods of vigorous effort spread throughout the day. So you can imagine, as we're having our interview right now, we could get up from our desks, do a series of air squats for a minute, or burpees for a minute. And if you spread those throughout the day, is that sufficient to sort of move the needle on markers of fitness or blood markers of health? So it's really, I think, on a spectrum in terms of the time commitment.
Right. And that's ongoing. Do you have results from that yet?
Well, we do know that from our small lab-based proof of concept studies that, for example, 6 weeks of this exercise snacking type approach can measurably improve cardiorespiratory fitness, and it can elicit some changes in blood health markers related to blood fats or insulin sensitivity. Again, these are small scale initial studies to start, and what we have right now are some ongoing multi-site randomized trials trying to look at this in more detail in larger numbers of individuals.